Good afternoon, everybody from chilly UK, though I have to say I think Canada wins at -55 or -37, depending where you live. So you get the prize, but it is cold in the UK. But a warm welcome from the RCN. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. We've got a great audience today, so that's absolutely fantastic. My name is Jane Brooks, and I have the privilege and pleasure of chairing this session because I am a part of the steering committee for the History of Nursing Society of the Royal College of Nursing. And the event is held in partnership with the RCN Library and Archives Service. It is a real pleasure for me to introduce Professor Hallam to talk to us today. Professor Emerita Julia Hallam is member of the Communication and Media School of Arts at the University of Liverpool and is speaking to us from Liverpool, where they don't have snow. She's a film and media scholar and former nurse and health visitor, and has published widely on representations of nursing, health and medicine, including medical fictions, which she edited with Moody in 1998. And then her most famous and absolutely fantastic monograph, which I'm sure many of us have read and loved, Nursing the Image, Media, Culture and Professional Identity from 2000. She's also published numerous journal articles, book chapters, edited journal editions, including Screening Old Age, Journal of British Cinema and Television in 2016, The Medical Issue, Critical Studies in Television with Hannah Hammond in 2017. Her latest book is Movies, Music and Memory, Tools for Wellbeing in Later Life, published by Emerald in 2020, and is co-edited with Lisa Shaw. She's an academic version of this talk coming out in a new collection of writings on nurses in the media called Picture Perfect, Postcard Images of Nursing and Nursing, 1890 to 1920 in M. Harms, B. Harms and M. Harms edited book, Sex, Pots and Saints, Essays on the Media History of Nurses and Nursing, McFarland, Jefferson, North Carolina, which is coming out next year, and which I'm sure many of us, now we've heard the title, will want to go out and get. And after having listened to Professor Hallam, I'm sure we'll all be really keen to listen to read her latest work. So once again, very great pleasure to introduce Professor Hallam, and I'll now be quiet and let you continue. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Sarah. I particularly want to thank you, all of you, for joining the Zoom talk today. I hope you find the session enjoyable and interesting. When Sarah kindly invited me to give the talk, the events that we are faced with now were unprecedented. In the intervening 12 months, we've experienced a crisis in our health and well-being, unimagined by many of us. As they have done throughout history of the profession, nurses have been on the front line, caring for those suffering with COVID-19, risking their own lives, health and well-being in the process. I would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone working in our hospitals, care homes and health services for caring for us and helping to keep us safe and well throughout what is a very difficult time. I want to start by placing my interest in image nursing in the context of a wider discussion that I hope this talk contributes to, which is issues of gender, class and whiteness in our society, and of course the ways that they are continue to be a big issue in nursing in various ways. Growing up female in the 50s in a conservative working class home, my horizons about what I could do when I grew up and what I could be, who I could be, were circumscribed, as most people's are, by circumstances of gender and background. Possibilities included being a shop assistant, like my auntie, or being a nursing auxiliary, like my other auntie. So perhaps it's unsurprising that when I left school at 15, I became a shop assistant. And a few years later, when I was old enough, I started my nurse training. Like many girls in the 50s, I read the nursing career books, Sue Barton, Cherry Ames, and they undoubtedly influenced me. Talking with many women during my career in nursing who started nursing because they were influenced by stories in books and magazines, I decided when I began my degree that I would do some postgraduate research into the reasons that people became nursing. And this later became a book, which Jane has already kindly mentioned, Nursing the Image. And as this part of this research, I interviewed a number of women who, like me, began their training in the 60s and 70s, all of whom have been influenced in their decisions by popular images of nurses on the screen in TV series. Remember, some of us will remember things like Emergency Ward 10 and Dr. Kildare, in stories, in magazines, and in all these ways that as young women were influenced to become who we become in our society, which is not always necessarily who we find out we really want to be. So it's very interesting that Sarah chose the postcard Medicate, an image from 1906, to advertise this talk by me. Medicate is an image advertising a book in the Katie series for girls. And it's that slide which opens this talk, and perhaps that we could have the image of the talk on the screen now for just to remind people. I'm not sure if it's there or not. I can't see it at the moment. Can we have slide 1, please, which is the opening slide? Okay.
Yeah, it is on the screen.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, right. I presume that we're all ahead. We can go ahead with the slides. Okay, that's great. Thanks, Sarah. In 2013, Patricia Toohey, who's head of exhibitions at the National Library of Medicine in Washington, read my book and invited me to curate an exhibition and online digital gallery of 500 cards from a postcard collection of over 2,500, which was donated by Michael Zwerdling, a former nurse at Providence Hospital in Washington. Jane has looked at this book and agrees with me. It's an amazing book, really, and covers many, many more of the images than I can hope to touch on in the talk today. The postcards that I'm going to talk about today are from the period 1890 to 1915. And the reason for that is this is often referred to as the golden age of the postcard and one of the largest groups of the cards in the collection. The collection offers the opportunity to talk about a wide range of topics in the portrayal of nurses in popular culture. But I want to confine today's talk to examine the ways in which these cards set a precedent for the images I found were most prevalent when researching images of the profession in the aftermath of World War II. The talk is in 3 main sections. First of all, a discussion of the development of the postcard, which has some, not too much, I hope, academic context around it in terms of the socio-historical context of that time. And then I'll talk about the photo cards in the collection. These cards reveal the ways in which nurses themselves and the institutions that promoted them in their work were regarded. In the 1900s, in many countries around the world, nursing was seen as the epitome of respectability. The cards provide a valuable counterpoint to the 2 sets of images that follow, a discussion of the saucy images and infantile cartoons on the illustrated cards that are a precursor to the naughty nurse image that proliferates in the UK from the 1930s onwards. And finally, I'm going to focus on the early 20th century when Western culture, the Western cultural imaginary that associates female nurses with images of guardian angels and protective battle axes. Can we have the web page, the next slide, please, on the screen? I think you can just probably see there some of the rich wealth of images that figure on just that first bit of the exhibition's web page. The details of that web page, I'm sure we'll give to you at the end of the talk if you wish to locate it. This is the web page of the National Library of Medicine, by the way. To begin with then, some socio-cultural context on the development of the postcard. The linguist and historian Julia Gillan argues that the speed of change in the late 19th and earliest 20th century in the UK, Europe, and North America was in many ways very similar to our own times today, with rapid developments in transportation, manufacturing processes, and communication systems contributing to a feeling of living in an accelerating time of change. Between 1901 and 1910 in Britain, according to the Postmaster General, almost 6 billion postcards were sent, with postal deliveries in many towns and cities numbering more than 6 a day. By the beginning of the 20th century, the picture postcard was considered by some observers to epitomize the spirit of the era and present a candid revelation of our pursuits and pastimes, our customs and costumes, our morals and manners. The ways in which this spirit of the era infuses images of nurses is illustrated in the postcards. They reveal how the nursing profession was regarded in the popular imagination, not only in the United States, Britain, and Europe, but also in the deeply rooted social and cultural attitudes to what were at that time faraway places, such as Japan, Russia, and parts of Africa and China. Ranging from photographic portraits of individuals and groups to highly illustrative drawings and cartoons, the Zwerdling collection exemplifies, for the most part, the ways in which nursing was, by the late 1900s, publicly perceived as a female profession. Drawing on arguments from my book, I will suggest that the popular images of nurses revealed on the postcards are built on 19th century ideas about the ideal woman and how she should behave, both personally and in the public domain. These ideas were circulated in handbooks of social etiquette and imbued into middle-class young women as part of their education. This feminine ideal, as I termed it, was taken up by 19th century artists, pre-Raphaelites, for example, and copiously recreated by postcard illustrators in their interpretations of classical art and religious iconography. For some researchers, the images on the postcards extend what academics sometimes call the collective visual imaginary, the ways in which images of past times create a visual memory of that society. Postcards of nursing in this context constitute a visual memory of the ways in which Western societies saw the nursing profession at that time, and in turn, the ways in which the profession visualized itself. Slide 3, please, now. The earliest card in the collection is an advertisement for a nursing agency, and this has a distinct resemblance to an early trade card. Postcards evolved from 18th century forms of elite and upwardly mobile forms of social and commercial advertising and interaction, such as trade cards and visiting cards. The visiting or calling card, which I'm sure some of you have heard about, was used for various purposes, such as introductions at social gatherings and visiting people in their own homes. The trade card was distributed through personal contacts to business associations and organizations. Some of them were highly ornate, others, like this early postcard, focused on describing in detail the goods and services on offer. The next card, please. Next slide. The next slide outlines a few of the principal events in postcard history. I jotted them down there rather than go into them in too much detail. But I thought you'd be interested to know that, first of all, it was the reform of the postal service in Britain in 1840, which required all mail to be prepaid by the sender rather than paid for by the receiver, was quickly followed by changes across the US and Europe. It was accompanied in Britain by the introduction of the penny black postage stamp. In the United States, the Postal Act of 1861 allowed cards weighing less than an ounce to be sent by mail, but it wasn't until after the Civil War that the first cards were sent. In 1869, postal card services in Austria-Hungary developed a ready stamp card that set a standard size for the growing industry of manufacturing postcards throughout Europe, with Germany becoming the home of the printed colour process known as chromolithography. Next card, please. An example of this form of printing from 1899 is seen in this card, where a woman dressed as a nurse is used to advertise the efficacy of John Hoff's malt extract for the treatment of coughs. And these kinds of cards, advertising food, medicines, all sorts of treatments, often used images of women dressed as nurses to promote their goods. By 1902, new regulations permitted that one side of a card could be reserved for an illustration, the other split between space for a message and an address, establishing the standard postcard format that we still use today. In 1903, the 3A Kodak folding hand camera was invented, and this soon became very popular throughout Europe and in the United States for making photographic prints for postcards in what had become by the mid-1900s the standard format size of 3¼ inches by 5½ inches. This led to a rapid increase in cards featuring portraits, the cheap and relatively fast method of processing responsible for the standardization in style in the numerous portraits of nurses on postcards that appear in the collection around this time. If we could now look at some examples. Next slide, please. Here we can see a portrait of a nurse with her graduation certificate. Her name's Ida G. Berver, and the postcards from around 1910. On the right, we can see a portrait of a career nurse. Her name is Sister Grace, and she was matron of the Jamestown Girls Institute, a mission school in what is now Nigeria, around 1910. So these cards then were sent to friends, and also, I think, often accompanied applications for jobs and work as evidence of their status and their personal achievements. The captured moments on these cards, of which there are numerous online in the digital gallery, but a huge number in Swerdling's book, are often clues to a larger picture, such as, for example, in the case of nurses in uniform, the type of training an individual had undertaken, the values that the institution was instilling in its graduates, the kinds of institutions that were training nurses at that particular time, many of course were faith-based, the places where training was being undertaken, the kinds of tasks that nurses were performing, and the responsibilities and duties that constituted professional identity. For example, in this next slide, the nurses graduating in the group photograph are from a sanatorium hospital in Albuquerque. In the early 1900s, a third of the population of this small town in New Mexico were visitors suffering from tuberculosis, who were staying in Albuquerque in the hope that the dry, warm desert air might cure them, or at the very least alleviate their symptoms. You'll notice that there are two male nurses in the picture, demonstrating that male nurses have undertaken training in many institutions since the early days of the profession. The next slide is from Battle Creek Sanatoria in Michigan, a health spa run by Dr. John Kellogg, him of Kellogg's Cornflakes, of course, which housed a hospital with research facilities and a nursing school, as well as the Sanatoria Food Company. The company also produced its own postcards to advertise its services. In this image of the graduation ceremony in Michigan, around just under a third of the graduating nurses are male, and according to Battle Creek Advertising, About a third of the staff were male and would administer the spa's health treatments to its wealthy paying customers. If you can make that out there, it also says in the flowers around the garland, around the nurses, where duty, I think it says where duty comes first or where duty is foremost, something of that. We couldn't quite make it out. So the next slide, please, is a portrait of the women at Brewster Training Hospital in Jackson, Florida. And this was an early training school for African American women, established by the Women's Division of the Methodist Board of Missions after the Great Fire of 1901 left many people without any form of medical care. So as well as proof of their professional qualifications, photo cards were a recruitment tool for these training schools, for nursing organisations, nursing agencies, hospitals and institutions. And they were, of course, also used to raise money for charitable organisations that provided nursing services to those in need. Could we have the next slide, please? In the US, much of the work in training hospitals was undertaken by the trainees. Once they graduated, there were few opportunities in hospitals, and many nurses joined agencies and became private duty nurses. These were nurses employed by a patient or their family to care for them or their relatives or their children. Others joined missionary organizations. These postcards from around 1910 show an African-American nurse caring for a child on the left, and a man described as a missionary nurse dressed in civvies top and below, draped in the US flag and a Native American blanket. Next slide, please. Some nurses took up posts in mission hospitals in what were at the time far-flung places such as China. This hand-tinted postcard depicts a UK Anglican mission hospital in what at the time was known as Peking, now Beijing of course, sometime between 1910 and 1920. And it was sent as a birthday greeting to Willie from Aunt Joan. And I've often wondered if that's Aunt Joan seated on my front right. Could we have the next card, please? Photo cards also show us the range of the career possibilities open to qualified nurses, such as these images of district or community nursing in the UK and US. And the first of these was taken in Nottinghamshire around 1908. I rather like that one. These cards also revealed the differences in services at this time. The next card was sold in aid of funds for the Toledo District Nurses Association in New Orleans around 1913. And again, we can see the very different circumstances there of the woman who's the district nurse, who still looks relatively old-fashioned compared to her opposite number in the UK. Could we have the next card, please? And this card shows a rural nurse conducting her visits by donkey in Oklahoma City in 1913. John's nurse is the message on the back, along with the address to someone. It doesn't actually say anything else about this nurse. We also have images of community home nursing, nurses driving cars, using bicycles, and in one of my favourite images from the early 1920s of a district nurse on a motorcycle driving through the Scottish Highlands on her rounds of visits. Could we have the next card, please? Other early postcards are of military nurses, such as this British group heading for the Boer War around 1899. There are numerous portraits of military nurses in the collection and of Red Cross nurses, including, of course, images of European royalty, who were often patrons of their nation's Red Cross movement. And this is pictures of royalty in Red Cross uniforms. Could we have the next slide, please? Finally, amongst the photo cards I want to mention today, there are records of hospital work. This one is of nurses delivering the revolutionary Finson light treatment at the London hospital, which was used to successfully treat patients suffering from lupus vulgaris. And this was a form of microbacterial tubercular skin infection, which actually the Finson light treatment was shown to alleviate it, in some cases cure. So it was very effective. I hope I've encouraged you to explore the photo cards in more depth. In all of these cards, nursing is depicted as a highly respectable profession, mostly for white women, but the growing numbers of African-American nurses graduating from training schools such as the Brewster in Florida and from the missionary training schools in many countries that have been colonized by Europeans began to challenge that ideal. There is also an acknowledgement of the presence of men. In health spas such as Battle Creek and in the missionary medical services, as well as in the psychiatric hospitals, a closer look at the photo cards of male nurses reveals that unlike their white female counterparts, they were probably mostly working class blue collar men who regarded nursing as a trade rather than a profession. Although I've not found any evidence to support this claim, other than in histories of psychiatric nursing, which was, of course, the area of the profession which had considerably more men entering it. I'd like to move on now to the second type of postcard in the collection. I want to discuss the saucy, sexy, and sentimental cartoon images of nurses found on the illustrated cards. And here we see a rather different image against the sort of respectable pictures that we've just been looking at. I'll start with a card that will be familiar to some people in the UK, the saucy cartoon images created by artists such as Donna McGill in the 30s, 40s and 50s of saucy basically, these were what were often called as saucy or rude postcards they were often sold at seasides, and they had on them popular stereotypes: large ladies, long-suffering husbands and mother-in-laws, vicious mother-in-laws, vicars, and of course nurses. And sales of these kinds of cards had already reached around 60 million a year in the 1930s. The jokes on the cards rely on innuendo, often visually implied alongside the verbal suggestion, as we can see here. Saucy nurse cards such as this invariably feature an overtly sexualized image of a young woman dressed as a nurse in a tight-fitting uniform that accentuates her physicality, and an older, overweight, bad-tempered looking female who's often the senior nurse, a sister or a matron, commonly known by the time I was nursing as a battle axe. But as we'll see, the battle axe has a rather double-edged meaning in terms of the talk today. Could we look at the next slide, please? Somewhat surprisingly, given the popularity of battle axe images by the 30s and 40s, one of the earliest popular cartoon images of a modern battle axe, the illustrations of Dickens' nurse Sarah Gamp from Martin Chuzzlewit, rarely feature on early postcards. Only one card from the 1910s depicts a figure that looks anything like a Gamp. A child held by the hand of a red-faced, scowling older nurse in a long cap states a preference for another nurse nearby who is young, attractive and smiling. Indeed, what we mostly see in the images of the earliest 20th century are the ones that, such as like Sarah, chose to promote the talk. Could we look at the next slide, please? So here we are back at Medicate, and this is pretty typical, of the kind of image promoted on the cards at this time. The earliest card to feature this kind of image is this one, 1906. And as you probably all noted, it's a coloured illustration of a white woman in a Red Cross uniform, playfully pouring a liquid, which we would assume to be some kind of medicine, from a bottle into a glass. And she wears a red striped dress that appears to be blown upward by the wind, revealing layers of frilly petticoats and her stockings, complete with garters, brandishing a Red Cross symbol, kind of early form of Marilyn Monroe, standing over the ventilation system, I think. The card, as noted earlier, advertised a novel in the Katie Girls series for girls. Presumably, the address of this card was to the adult buyer of the book, rather than the 12-year-old girl who features in the stories. That we do not know. Early postcards often feature this kind of saucy image of a young, attractive white woman dressed in fashionable interpretations of a nurse's uniform, sometimes engaged in various forms of sexual innuendo and play with her male patients. One series of cards in the collection is a narrative sequence with short comments and decorative graphics, creating a cheeky innuendo that parallels the ongoing visual action. Next card, please. In Court with the Goods, a woman is dressed as a nurse, sitting alongside her bedridden male patient. She is laughingly resisting his attempts to kiss her. They're caught in this compromising position by the patient's wife. The message on the back says, "Mabel, how would you like to be this poor girl? Ha ha." The card was unsigned, indicating that the sender was perhaps well known to the recipient. Could we look at the next card, please? In a similar vein, I'm feeling much improved, is of a young man sitting in a chair in his dressing gown, tying the shoelaces of a young woman in a nurse's uniform, sitting on the bed with her skirts lifted to show her legs and feet. These fantasies were a more respectable version of the What the Butler Saw mutoscope peep shows, popular in amusement arcades from the early 1900s, where the flipbook mechanism creates a moving image of a young woman removing her clothes, supposedly without knowing that she is being watched. The frequency of these fantasies, particularly notable in early US postcards, can be explained, I think, in part by the private healthcare system operating in the US at the time. As I mentioned earlier, hospitals training nurses relied on their students to care for patients. Once trained, private duty nursing, where the nurse was employed by the patient or the patient's family, was one of the few employment options open for professional nurses in the US. On many of these cards, nurses are shown as sentimentalized objects of romantic attraction. Before the outbreak of war, they're found on Valentine and other cards that picture the nurse as a pretty, innocent, sometimes childish young woman, a style of depiction that emphasizes her wholesomeness, good looks, and personal attractiveness as a nurse as her key attributes. Next slide, please. An early version of this type of card from 1903 features a child dressed as a nurse offering her doll a spoonful of medicine. An illustrated border is entwined with the words, "If you can heal a wounded heart, pray heal mine from Cupid's dart." In wartime, these attributes continued to be emphasized, with illustrations of attractive and sometimes glamorous nurses partnering their handsome soldier patients, becoming increasingly common. Next card, please. On this one, I don't know if you can see it, but instead of the red cross, the nurse actually has a red heart on her chest. In these illustrations, the bodies and sometimes the heads and faces of the nurses and their patients are close together. The nurse a comforting presence as she supports her soldier boyfriend, creating an image of caring and adoring dependency. Many of the comic cards featuring these male and female pairings adopt a less realistic style that verges on caricature and exaggeration rather than saucy innuendo. The next card, please. Some of these images are what we would call today cute, featuring childish images of cherubic nurses with large heads and big eyes. Forget Me Not by the illustrator Eugenie Richards from about 1910 is very typical of the style. A young girl or child dressed as a nurse wears a white hat, a frilly underskirt visible beneath her dress. Small wings sprout from her shoulders. In these cartoons, the nurses are drawn as childlike dolls, their outsized faces dominated by large doe-like eyes and small bow-shaped lips, an image of innocence and wide-eyed naivety. In a number of cartoons, nursing work is humorously interpreted as a child's play, where the female figures are always nurses, the males always either patients or doctors. Next card, please. In Grace Widerstein's cartoons of the same period, the children are drawn with large heads, chubby round faces and rosy cheeks. In his first case, a doll lies in the bed, the nurse standing by her, hands clasped meekly together. The boy doctor, carrying a Gladstone-style bag and wearing a top hat and striped suit, is striding in with a surprised expression as he looks at his watch. The importance of the dynamic, authoritative figure is emphasized by the way of contrast to the static, submissive figure of the nurse. Nursing in these cards is visualized as child's play, the lesser value of the female caring role accentuated by the dynamics of the graphic hierarchies in the illustrations of the game. Versions of this game are found on cards featuring animals, dolls, puppets, and of course on the many photographs of children dressed as nurses that feature in the collection. These saucy and sentimental images stand in stark contrast to the portraits of professional nurses I was showing you on the photo cards. These nurses, in their smart and spotless uniforms, present themselves as serious, respectable women. They do, however, reveal the underlying tensions hidden beneath the veil of respectability. The private nurse is a paid household servant. The African-American nurse caring for a white child, of which there are several images in the collection, has replaced enslavement with servitude. In group photos of hospital staff, a doctor, often the only male who is not a patient, is frequently depicted in the center of the picture as the patriarchal head of an all-female workforce. Finally, in the context of our current pandemic and the projections of superhero nurses found in murals around the world, on social media, and in images such as the Banksy picture in Southampton Hospital, which many of you will be aware of, I want to explore the religious and mythical associations on postcards depicted in images of guardian angels and battle axes. Could I have the next slide, please? Morphing between ancient archetypes of battling goddesses, religious references, and modern associations of white middle-class femininity associated with Florence Nightingale's popular image as the lady with the lamp. Images of nurses as guardian angels and battle axes are found on postcards from across the spectrum of European nations. Designed to invoke complex emotions of female bravery, perseverance, self-sacrifice and martyrdom, alongside professional pride and nationalism, they provide material evidence of the relationship between the professional feminine ideal of white middle-class femininity and the deep cultural roots that inform the gendering of the profession. Images of nurses in the European art traditions of the 19th and 20th centuries were often based on ancient classical and Christian female archetypes such as healer, handmaiden, angel, guardian, warrior, and mother. In Nursing the Image, I argue that professional nursing is founded on Nightingale's appropriation of the characteristics associated with respectable middle-class women, As I mentioned earlier, special qualities of a moral and ethical nature were ascribed to women, which defined the domestic realm as their principal area of expertise and responsibility. Middle-class women were expected to exercise this influence on family and friends and to donate their leisure time to societies engaged in social and moral reform. This notion of the angel in the house, immortalised in the poem by Coventry Patmore in 1854, also applied to women nursing on the 19th century battlefields of Europe and America. Nightingale was, of course, also known as the Angel of the Crimea. Clara Barton, founder of the American Red Cross, was popularly known as the Angel on the Battlefield. And George Barton, not a relative, I don't think, wrote an account of the Catholic sisterhoods in the late Civil War period that he called Angels of the Battlefield. He wrote that in 1894, by the way. Next, please. Next slide, please. Sorry, these associations were drawn on and developed by postcard designers. Sorry, no, could we go back, Sarah? I've jumped ahead of myself there. Thank you. Sorry, I just forgot I hadn't told you about this card. This was a card developed by it's an Italian postcard of World War I depicting a classical image from a contemporary painting by an artist called Giovanni Carpenetto. And it's of a female nurse as a guardian angel kissing the forehead of a man wrapped in an Italian flag bearing the Red Cross. It was just to let you know what that image was that I've had you looking at while I was talking. The next image, please. Most of the angels we see, though, in British and American postcards are really these fresh-faced, young, attractive women, such as in An Angel of Mercy and The Real Angel of Mons, both cards that were circulated during the early days of the First World War. While European cards often feature women dressed in nurses' uniforms with wings sprouting from their shoulders that emphasize their associations with religious sisterhoods, as is in this next example, which is of the Belgian Red Cross. This is Belgian Red Cross nurse in this next card. And you can see here her religious associations are somewhat clearer than in the cards that were being produced in the UK and the US. There was, however, another side to Nightingale. Nightingale's reforms also invoked images of strong women willing to sacrifice themselves, fighting the twin evils of poverty and disease. With the tuberculosis endemic in Europe and the US at this time, images of female battle axes began to feature in a number of US and European public health campaigns. Next postcard, please. Postcards were one way in which various organisations and charities tried to raise public awareness about the disease and its prevention, as well as raising money for the cause. Various incarnations of the battle axe feature on these cards. This Spanish card advertising the medicinal properties of calcium chloride from around 1905 draws on an androgynous image of an Amazon carrying a large shield and wielding a sword against three monsters to support their claim for the effectiveness of their product against a range of common diseases, including tuberculosis. Next card, please. A postcard from 1910 advertising life insurance depicts a female protector clothed like a medieval goddess in a long white gown marked by the cross of Lorraine. Her cloak shields a mother and a baby from the shadowy figure of death, her other hand holding death's arm in her firm, muscular grip. I think you can see that, it's a bit faint. Next card, please. This is an Italian image from around the same time, produced for the Genoa Anti-TB Consortium, which combines the head and shoulders of an ancient winged goddess with that of the Lady of the Lamp, an image of nursing found internationally by this time. The Art Nouveau style combines the image of the goddess with that of an angel holding the lamp of knowledge or life, derived from, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong image here. No, I've lost an image somewhere in the transfer. Sorry about that. I do apologize. I'll just talk you through the image that I was wanting to show you, which is the last of these images. This particular image of a nurse is quite interesting, I think, because she combines both the religious associations and the more mythical associations that I've been talking about. The nurse's outstretched arms form a cross that, like the example described in the card I was talking about last, is enveloped by a cloak that embraces images of poor suffering people wrapped in snakes. In her outstretched hand, she holds a lamp with a red cross. The cross is repeated across her breast and forehead. Underlying this image of strength and resilience is another. The female guardian wards off the serpent Satan on many fronts, preventing the theft of souls and protecting the virtuous. By invoking both ancient and modern associations of care and protection and their associations with religion and respectable femininity, these postcards reveal how deeply rooted cultural legacies of white women's role in society underpin the multifaceted complexities of nursing's popular image at this time. This image, of course, still echoes in a modern form today. Could we look at the next slide, please? The image of nursing that many people have in mind when asked about nursing's public image today is that of a kind of superhero nurse. In the UK, this status was confirmed when graffiti artist Banksy painted a tribute to nursing staff that appeared on the wall of a Southampton hospital during the lockdown in May 2020. Although it has been around for some time, with images such as the one here available to download on t-shirts amidst a range of goods that depict the contemporary nurse as a superhero in a wide range of contexts. Like other images I've touched on today, it has its origins in ancient images of gods and goddesses with magical powers. The pages of Marvel comics and superhero films have become some of the biggest selling popular Hollywood products in recent years. And these films, of course, feature superheroes, and superheroes in the comics and the films are increasingly featuring people of different races and genders, moving away from the traditional image of the super powerful white male. And there is evidence online that the superhero images of nurses are beginning to follow suit. Next slide, please. I wanted to finish with this image of the Banksy super nurse from Southampton that was painted in June, I think it was, May, June of the first lockdown of the pandemic. We can read this as a subtle critique of the image of the traditional nurse. Eventually, the small boy who is controlling her movement will tire of her and she be discarded, thrown in the bin with his other superhero toys. In countries around the world, while I was looking at this image, many mural artists continue to portray nurses as imaginary winged female angels and superheroes, but many others are creating multivalent paintings of modern nursing. I'm sure that we will all agree that this is a welcome change in the public imagery of the profession, as it's fighting to achieve the financial recognition it's so justly deserves. And I think that is actually what I've been looking at in terms of these recent images, does give us some cause that for optimism, that the image of nursing can and does change and is modernising as we move forward with this nursing that so many of you are involved with in the pandemic. Thank you for listening. I'm sorry if I'm being a bit jittery in places. I haven't talked over Zoom before, and I haven't given a talk in a while actually, because I don't lecture anymore. So I hope you enjoyed it.